Today on The State of Us, bosses are back. The 4-day work week. Will it work? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by the one and only, your friendly redneck liberal, and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance Jackson. Today, we're looking at a cooling job market, putting bosses back in the driver's seat, as reported by the Wall Street Journal, how office conversions and old workplaces could be redeveloped into residential properties, but that could take time, and an interesting study conclusion in London reveals that a 4-day work week means shorter hours and potentially happier employees without affecting revenue. We're going to look at all of that and discuss it. What do you think, Lance? Which one are you most excited about?
Well, I think it's interesting. I'm remembering, right? I'm reminiscing a little bit. It's interesting when you talk about the 4-day work week, but also they talk about some of these places being open 7 days a week. And I'm thinking of the limited hours that places are open compared to what they've been the last 30 years. I mean, I remember a day when you couldn't go anywhere on Sunday, that after church, other than one or two restaurants, there was nothing open. You couldn't go to the grocery store. You couldn't go clothes shopping. You couldn't go to the movie theater. And then there was that time when you get into the late 70s into the 80s, 1980s, all of a sudden the boom was 24 hours everything, right? And you could go grocery shopping in the middle of the night, and, people on second and third shifts were, really feeling like, hey, now there are things open that I can go and I can stop at the restaurant and get something to eat. And I'm starting to see, and I guess it's just this, the shift now is going towards, I'm driving through town, and after 10 o'clock, there's no place to get a burger. The grocery store's shutting down. And it's interesting. That's where kind of this whole spectrum of bosses and 4-day work week, that's kind of where it took me, was reminiscing and saying, maybe we're going back to that time when you were supposed to be home and cooking food at home and having family time and all of those things when I was growing up. And then it exploded into, hey, you're out all the time because you can get anything and everything. It was like New York City, even in small town America. And now that the job market has tightened a little bit, or there aren't people looking for jobs, businesses have closed or shortened hours. They're not open. I mean, the local pizza place here in our hometown is now only open 5 days a week. It's like, okay. So, but again, instead of seeing it as a downturn or a recession coming, maybe it's a slowing down of lifestyles that we're all just like, we're tired of go all the time.
Well, and I think it's a convergence of some different phenomenons as well. Try saying that fast. Because you had the pandemic, obviously, which sent a lot of people into a hybrid work or completely remote work standpoint, which may have sort of been the shock that was, hey, getting to spend a little bit more time at home might be a good thing. On the flip side, you also had bosses and CEOs looking and saying, hey, now that the pandemic is over, or we're on the back end of this, working from anywhere maybe went too far, and we're seeing some issues with, collaboration and burnout and some other things, the work-life balance. So we want people back in the office. And then it's, well, you've got all these empty offices, so what are you going to do with these? And we have a housing problem, and apartment prices are crazy, so maybe we're going to convert some of those into living. So there's a really weird sort of, I guess the thing that came to mind for me is like all these articles, when you look at them, with the exception of conversions fixing empty offices, they all take place within a 2-week time span. And it's, depending on which one you picked up and read, you get a very different feel of where things are at. But I think that is what tells us where the world is at right now, which is that there's a lot of sort of converging and competing ideas about where do we go from here.
We're really in a state of flux.
Yes.
Because at the same time that they're laying off workers, we have in service industries around us in the Midwest here, all kinds of help wanted signs. Now, they're more of the entry level jobs. They're not the kind of job that you're going to have a career in. But at the same time, we're seeing, was it Meta that laid off 12,000 workers or something like that? Mostly white collar jobs. I do feel strongly that this work from home thing, because I did it for a little bit. I mean, I actually taught from home and did some Zooms, that I thought that was more stressful than going to work. When people say they want less stress in their life, they don't want to go, and I didn't feel like it was as effective as being there in person. But I don't know if that's the old guy, the boomer talking, who just was used to going to work. I don't know, or if that's a reality. I didn't really feel like that was a good long-term solution for most people. Now, obviously we all are different, and there are people out there that I'm sure can work from home and be very effective and enjoy it and do a great job. I'm not saying, but for the masses, I'm not sure that paradigm shift worked as well as we were trying to make it sound like it worked. We know that laying off workers, and this is where the workers have come back, is a way for companies to show that they make a profit, which then makes their company more valuable to investors. So are these layoffs and things that we're hearing and reading about now, is this the typical January time when we do this to make our company look better at a time when the market is showing a lot of volatility because of the Federal Reserve messing around with interest rates? Maybe we're just looking at a different lifestyle than we've had the last 35 or 40 years. Maybe everybody figured out that it's not worth the rat race.
We have a local science museum here, and you walk in and there's a big pendulum, and it swings with the Earth's gravity. And that's not a pendulum. There's a special name for it. But that thing, and it goes around and it knocks over the dominoes in a circle. Well, it always swings back, right? But it really doesn't swing back to exactly the same spot. It inches ever so far to the left, to the right, and it keeps going around, and eventually it makes a full circle. And that's kind of, I think, what's happening now. As it's swinging back, the question is, how are these items going to turn into something new of saying, hey, maybe we don't want as fast as everything was going to keep going. Slow may not look exactly what it looked like 30 or 40 years ago, but there may be a new version of that. And when we look at bosses being back in charge, the job market is remaining historically tight. Unemployment stood at 3.5% in December of last year, and hourly earnings were up 4.6% year over year. About 11 million jobs remain unfilled as of December, which is an increase from November, according to the Labor Department. So it's not like, the labor shortage is gone and therefore bosses have tons of authority. But the thing that they are seeing is that many executives are saying they're no longer scrambling to retain workers. So what is the difference? The important difference there. The jobs might be open, but they're not seeing as many people leaving their job. Now, there's no data yet, at least to support this, but I think part of what you could be seeing there, Lance, is what you're talking about, wanting to slow down. People have been through, 3 years of, for a lot of people, a lot of changes, maybe not in their job, but how they did their job, right? Like I was going into the office every day, and then I went to 100% remote work, and that was stressful for these reasons. And then my bosses wanted me back, and that was stressful because now we're doing this hybrid thing, which is different than, it doesn't have to do so much with what it is you're doing. It's that there's been a lot of kind of jerking back and forth with how people were doing their jobs, or when or where. All things
that's added stress, added anxiety.
Stress, right?
I mean,
anytime you move or make a change, even if in the long term it's better, the initial shock wears on most people, So, and we had a lot of those in a 2 or 3 year period that were big adjustments to how things were working. So I think part of what you're seeing probably is that, we still have a lot of job openings, but workers are just they're less willing to say, I really want to change jobs,
Well, when you see layoffs going, even if it's not in your industry or your business, it gives you, I would think, second thoughts of whether or not I want to leave. because if you've stayed and been somewhere for a couple of years, you do have seniority, right? There is some comfort,
Right.
And you don't want to just chase the job, because as the bosses are saying, yeah, we're in a mode right now where we can kind of be particular about who we hire. We can go out and fill this, and we have this position open, but we can take our time and look at 20 applicants and pick the best person for the job, instead of before. We know that companies were just, we read repeatedly where companies were just blindly taking applicants and sticking them in a job because they needed warm bodies. That seems to not be the case anymore. But then the question becomes, to me, I don't think we're going to see people going back to the office. And so then we have that piece that we're going to talk about here coming up, about what do you do with all these office spaces that are open? And, we're big here on this show. We've talked a lot about homelessness and how different cities around the United States are dealing with it and trying to find places for people to live and get them employment and things like that. So there is this, okay, we have two problems. We have a homeless problem here in the United States, and we have empty office buildings. Is there some way we can merge these?
Even when bosses are demanding workers back into the office, we've also seen some larger companies that have lots of office space cutting parts of their workforce in an effort to save money. The chief economist at ZipRecruiter said that January is usually the peak month for layoffs, even during robust growth periods. That said, in many sectors, layoffs in January and firings have remained well below the pre-pandemic levels, about 1.35 million overall in November, compared with about 1.9 million a month during the strong market before the pandemic. So the other thing is, yes, we're hearing all this flashy stuff about layoffs, at these big tech companies, but those are more of a outlier than they are the rule. Yes, layoffs and such are still happening. They took place in January, but there's not as many. So what is happening if bosses are saying we got to go back to the office? There are less workers. There are empty offices. Some companies have already said we're not going back at all, like we're never going back. So what do you do if you're a commercial real estate owner, and you're sitting there with these offices and it's like, so are they coming back or not? What's happening? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Bosses are more willing to reassert their authority and risk workers leaving amongst a desire, I guess is the right word, to return to the office, or at least to partially return to the office, because part of what we're talking about today too is a study that was conducted in London across a number of different organizations that found that a 4-day work week might actually be something that's good for everybody. And that raises a question not only of, okay, if I want the workers in the office, right, Lance? But what if they're only going to come 4 days a week? Does it really make sense for me to pay, for example, for 7 days of access? Because, it's not like for most companies, it's not like, well, you lose access on, the weekend, but usually nobody's there. So you got these offices and it's like, well, I'm paying for 2 days a week that I don't need.
Right.
It's not like an apartment where I'm going to go here
well,
every
now you
day.
add a third day. So basically you're in a 4-week month, you have 12 out of the 30 days that you're not using the space. I mean, that's quite a large number. I mean,
it is. But what
do you
begs
do with
that
it,
question of, right, then what do you do? How?
But let's step back here, because you're going to have to explain this to me. Okay. Because I've never worked. I mean, I always thought I was lucky if I was working a 5-day work week. A 5-day work week, folks. I said that. Okay. That's what I meant. Because most of my life I've worked 6 days or longer. And sometimes even on the 7th day, which threw my grandparents and my wife's parents and grandparents into a fit, because it's like Sunday is the Sabbath. You're supposed to rest. there's, not to get religious necessarily, but there are a lot of good teachings among the religious leaders of the world. And that idea of resting on the Sabbath, and having a day to refresh and not do anything. I know that I'm thinking of my mother-in-law here when I first started to date my wife, and she didn't believe in going to the movie theater. She didn't believe in going shopping, going to the grocery store. It was like, you found something to do after church on Sunday to keep yourself occupied. And you had food in the house, even if you found something for dinner on Sunday, you went for a walk. And they were big for going on drives and relaxing and driving into the countryside and just seeing houses and looking at nature or whatever, going for a walk. Is that where we're going? I mean, again, should we never have left that, to where now I feel, I'm their age now, and I like my downtime. But to go to 4 days a week, you've got to explain that to me.
We underestimate, I think, too often the value that geography and the societal impacts of that make to our outlook and philosophy of what is work, how often should we go, what should we do, what equals hard work and what doesn't. Because the one thing is, like, the study and information I'm about to share with you was in London. And we want to say, well, London's a lot like us. And it's like, well, yeah, there are lots of similarities, but also, you could probably find 30 or 40 pretty substantive things that somebody living day to day, in London would do differently than you would do if you lived, for example, in Urbana, Ohio, or even if you lived in Urbana, Ohio versus New York City or Los Angeles, or where Lance is from in Missouri. And we're all in the same country, and our day-to-day lives can look pretty different. And even less so than geography, just industry can make a huge difference. If your family historically has been in a certain industry, your notion of what a workday is and how long it is might be very different from other people's. Because, for example, I mean, the 4-day work week, oh my gosh, things are falling apart. It's like, well, there's lots of people, that are in healthcare and other industries where working a longer shift, fewer days a week is what they have always done, or they've always done for their career, and that's not weird to them. It would be weird for them it would be impossible for some of them to do 6 days of work a week. Or doctors who, for example, sometimes will spend 5, 6, 7 days in a row working, but then not work for another 7 days, So I guess the whole point is, what I'm trying to get at there is, we all have a built-in sort of stereotypical idea of what a workday is in our head, but that's largely based around, just like everything, what's our experience and the people that we know. But chances are, if you can think it, there's probably somebody out there that works it in terms of a schedule. So is a 4-day work week a monumental, crazy thing that's never been done? No. But is it strange if that is what became sort of the norm versus the more traditional 5-day week that most of us, 5 days, 8 hours a day, that I think is the most stereotypical assumed, schedule. So let's look at what they found out. In London, work less, get more. A trial of a 4-day work week in Britain, billed as the world's largest ever, has found that an overwhelming majority of the 61 companies that participated from June to December of last year will keep going with the shorter hours, and that most employees were less stressed and had better work-life balance. That was all while companies' reported revenue largely stayed the same during the trial period last year and even grew compared with the same 6 months a year earlier, according to findings released this week.
But there could be a lot of reasons why that happened. Not the fact that it was
a correlation causation moment here.
Right.
Because it's not because we went to a shorter week.
You're coming out of a pandemic. People are buying more. People have access to more money. There's all kinds of reasons as to why that could happen. It just didn't happen because it was a 4-day work week. I mean, and to the other points, here in the United States, even those people, and I'm thinking of firefighters and nurses and health workers and those kind of people, they do that 3 on, 2 off, 4 days one week, 3 days the next week. They're still reaching the 40-hour work week. What they were doing in England, they were actually cutting the number of hours down
Correct.
into the mid 30s.
Yes.
So they weren't working these
32-ish hours a week instead of.
They weren't working these longer shifts, because I remember back in the 80s and 90s, there were companies in Columbus that were offering that to their employees. Come in an hour earlier, stay an hour later, and pick a day of the week that you want off. But now here, when I was dilly-dallying with that early in my career, the interesting thing was you weren't getting a Monday off or a Friday off. You didn't get to extend the weekend. You were getting a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday off, which typically were slower days for the company, so they could absorb not having people there on those days. But everybody had to come to work on Monday, and everybody had to come to work on Friday. But if you wanted to stay a little bit extra and pick up your hours or come in early, then you could take a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday off.
The research was conducted by Cambridge University, Boston College, Autonomy, which is a research organization, and the 4-day week global nonprofit across 2,900 workers over these 61 companies. Not surprisingly, employees reported benefits with 71% less burned out, 39% less stressed, and 48% more satisfied with their job than before the trial. Of the workers, 60 said it was easier to balance work and personal responsibilities at home, while 73% reported increased satisfaction with their lives. Fatigue was down, people were sleeping more, and mental health improved, the findings show. That's just what happened at a fish and chips restaurant in the English seaside town of Wells next to the sea, especially in the hospitality industry where people often work 7 days a week. The thing that came to mind when I was reading that, though, Lance, is we have this labor shortage. If you work less, if a company offers less total hours, but they're one of those industries that needs to be open, for example, at least 6 days a week, maybe 7, then the only solution is more people to work. So I think
more of a gig economy where nobody's making any money to get ahead anyway. Right. That's the whole fallout.
Is that
now
amidst the conversation that we've been having, though, for a number of months about what will retirement look like for future generations versus what does it look like for generations currently, and the notion that retirement, the way that we've come to know it anyway, of you could be done somewhere between 55 and 65 and have 20 or 30 years of basically, maybe some work and volunteer stuff, but you're not doing a full-time 40-hour-a-week job like you used to or more. You've cut back substantially. Maybe part of what's taking place here is saying, you don't need to save all this money for retirement because you're not going to retire, or you're going to retire for a couple years.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Which is to the pendulum thing, right? Of I don't need to work 6 days a week because I don't need to save over $1 million for this retirement that's going to last 20 years because that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to work 4 days a week, not save as much money, but have 3 days a week for my whole life, that I don't have to work. We just did a show recently on the transition from the potential 40-year to 60-year career, and what are the implications of that and how does it change? If you worked a 40-year career, okay, at 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, okay, so we're assuming 10 days off a year, which coincides with there's 10 federally recognized holidays that so we're just for some basic math, right? That's 2,000 hours a year. Simple math there. 2,000 hours a year, 80,000 hours in a working lifetime.
Of 40 years.
Of 40 years.
Right.
Of a 40-year career, right?
Right.
Now, what if we say we cut out 1 day a week and go to a 4-day a week? Well, that's 32 hours a week instead of 40, right? That's 1,600 hours a year versus 2,000. So 400 hours less a year. But if we go to a 60-year career instead of a 40, you actually work 96,000 hours, or 16,000 more hours than the counterparts who only worked a 40-year career. So does it I guess this is the message, from the young person looking at, and this is a young person who does not work a 4-day work week, but sounds like a nice thing. But the message is right. It's not, oh my gosh, people are working less. They're just, to your point, Lance, shifting when they work. In fact, if we move to this 60-year career and you only cut 1 day a week, current generations will actually have worked more on average than past generations will have worked, not less. So the notion that, this is younger generations being lazy, I'm not sure that anybody can, other than what we're doing right now, really materialize that argument of saying, why do I want 4 days a week? Well, if I don't really look at retirement as something that's going to happen in my 50s or 60s, I want 4 days a week,
Sure.
because I am going to want less time at work each week because I'm going to spend more time at work over my lifetime.
And my body's going to need that time off because I'm going to go to work for 15 or 20 years longer than my parents or grandparents did.
Right.
So therefore my body needs time to recover, or I can't push it as much when I'm younger because I'm going to need it when I hit my late 60s, 70s, and older.
By our simple calculations, if you're using the traditional, work week right now as the benchmark, the generations today that are going to work 60-year careers will actually put in 8 more years of work on the job than
in their work life,
right, than their counterparts did in previous generations.
Right.
So
it's an interesting number to discuss.
Like we've talked about, though, that's one of those nuanced things, right? It's hard to just.
It's hard, and it's also
easy to boil it down into a headline and say, "Oh, look, 4-hour work weeks, aren't they great?" And then everybody's like, "Whoa, this is terrible. This could be awful because how are people only going to work 4 days a week?" Well, if you only work 4 days a week, but you work 20 years longer, it turns out that you actually ended up working more than if you had worked a 5-day week and only worked for 40 years. So yeah, I think really, Lance, what it comes down to is that question of what does make people the happiest and work the best, right? And what fits with our current economy. We're going to discuss those and more. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. I don't know if I explained it or not, Lance. I tried, but...
Well, you said, I thought you explained it pretty well, but you said something as we went to break that I have to comment on.
Oh, okay.
How do you make the most money? Okay. I feel better doing this and I do feel better doing that. I still have that, that old guy is like, yeah, but you're not making as much money. So are you going to be satisfied to live with less?
Law of accelerating returns, right?
Right.
I mean, the math that we all worked out, yeah, you worked more, but the other thing is I'd almost bet you that even though you worked 8 years longer, you probably didn't end up with more wealth.
Right.
Maybe you ended up with close to the same, but I bet if we run our financial calculators, because you can't save as much money because you're working less days a week, you also therefore don't build up as much as investments and wealth, not because...
But you don't need it because you're going to continue to work, right?
I mean, well, yeah, that's the argument.
Now I'm arguing with myself, and I understand that, but that's...
Yeah, I don't need $2 million in, investments when I retire because I'm not going to retire for 20 years. I'm going to retire for 4, fully retire, as in I'm done working. I don't do anything other than exactly what I want to do. That kind of thing.
Okay, but we still have it, and I get that, and I thought you did a good job, but I just had to throw that in there because me getting all squirmy about I gotta have money. But what about this idea? And just very quickly, we don't have a lot of time of trying to, because you do this, you're dabbling in this now, converting office space into living spaces. I mean, you're not doing that per se, but you're kind of in real estate a little bit. You're dabbling in it. Is it a real possibility? I mean, the article's talking and it is giving these numbers that right now, even though housing costs are up, you can't get as much to rent this space for housing units as you can in a business. The business model allows you to rent the space more per foot. So you're going to lose money a little bit converting them. But does that make sense? I mean, to a neophyte like myself, it makes sense, right? I've got empty buildings or empty floors. Why not convert it into a loft apartment or a studio apartment and begin to put people in here and give them a place to live? Explain to me why that either works or doesn't work.
Well, so occupancy in top U.S. office markets is almost half pre-pandemic levels, according to swipe card data from employees. Vacancy rates are rising as companies let go of space when their leases come up for renewal. There's lots of potential reasons for this. Some are the obvious ones, but some are also that older offices, some have become functionally obsolete or they're fast approaching that. In other words, there's no reason for the commercial tenant to re-up their lease because it's like, yeah, I can move to a more modern, better office. I don't want this functionally out of date one. And so what happens is, well, you have vacancy and not just a little vacancy. In fact, it's about 13%, 17% in the U.S. Commercial real estate market right now for office space. And you compare that to the vacancy rate in the U.S. multifamily accommodations, which is only at 3.1%. So part of what we're talking about there, right, is this notion of this housing problem. So you've got all these, and people and what they want in housing, I think, changes too, right? If you're going to be home more, just like we talked about in the pandemic, that desire to have a workspace at home separate from your other living spaces, which had kind of faded out of style, altogether. Same thing with like, do we have a place that we all sit down and eat? Lots of smaller units and smaller apartments over time was like, not so much because I'm not here to eat.
That doesn't take place.
Right. Mm-hmm. But again, if those things start to shift, it becomes, well, those are things I'm going to want in my housing as well. So we already know that more housing is needed, right? Because basically, I mean, just for perspective, folks, right, a 3% vacancy rate basically means it's essentially no vacancy, right? I mean, because yes, there's vacancy, but really the vacancy, like probably 99% of all vacancy is apartments that are being turned to be taken over by somebody else or that are just not going to become apartments ever again. You know what I mean? There are things that are exiting the market, which is probably a tiny portion, or apartments that are being flipped, to be ready for the next tenant. So it's kind of a misnomer vacancy because it's
not like it's sitting empty, just waiting for somebody to come in.
Right. It doesn't mean like, there's all these places that are, 3%. 3% is basically nothing, where 17% on the other hand definitely means you have things sitting empty outside of the demand for the space. I guess the thing that I'll say is, a lot of the places that are coming open are outdated offices. So you're talking about, for the most part, you're talking about a total interior, renovation, and not just renovation, but major modifications. Because if you think about the modern office, right, it's not like there's a whole bunch of showers and bathrooms and kitchens. There's probably one kind of kitchen or kitchenette, right, and a set of restrooms for a floor of people. That obviously doesn't work if you're going to divide up that floor that was serving 2 or 3 office clients, with a centralized restroom and maybe people and what they want in housing, I think changes too, right? If you're going to be home more, just like we talked about in the pandemic, that desire to have a workspace at home separate from your other living spaces, which had kind of faded out of style, altogether. Same thing with like, do we have a place that we all sit down and eat? Lots of smaller units and smaller apartments over time was like, not so much because I'm not here to eat.
That doesn't take place.
Right. But again, if those things start to shift, it becomes, well, those are things I'm going to want in my housing as well. So we already know that more housing is needed, right? Because basically, I mean, just for perspective, folks, right, a 3% vacancy rate basically means it's essentially no vacancy, right? I mean, because yes, there's vacancy, but really the vacancy, like probably 99% of all vacancy is apartments that are being turned to be taken over by somebody else, or that are just not going to become apartments ever again. You know what I mean? There are things that are exiting the market, which is probably a tiny portion, or apartments that are being flipped, to be ready for the next tenant. So it's kind of a misnomer vacancy, because it's
not like it's sitting empty, just waiting for somebody to come in.
Right. It doesn't mean like, there's all these places that are, 3%. 3% is basically nothing, where 17% on the other hand definitely means you have things sitting empty outside of the demand for the space. I guess the thing that I'll say is, a lot of the places that are coming open are outdated offices. So you're talking about, I mean, for the most part, you're talking about a total interior, renovation, and not just renovation, but major modifications. Because if you think about the modern office, right, it's not like there's a whole bunch of showers and bathrooms and kitchens. There's probably one kind of kitchen or kitchenette, right, and a set of restrooms for a floor of people. That obviously doesn't work if you're going to divide up that floor that was serving 2 or 3 office clients, with a centralized restroom and maybe a kitchenette in each. You're not breaking that up into 3 units. You're probably breaking it up into something like 10 to 20 units.
And in the days of building, it's cheaper to tear down than it is to retrofit an office building into apartments.
It depends. I mean, that's part of what I think the reason this is not a clean cut thing is that varies a lot based on where are you and what's the demand. Like if you're in New York City, building anything new, and having to demolish what's there comes with all kinds of, one of the big reasons that especially in cities, people may look to say, yeah, we're going to renovate. Because if you tear down, right, and start with a new building, all sorts of things, especially like in New York City, air rights come into play. How tall can you build? How much parking do you have to have? There's all these
new codes and laws.
You have to come up to code on everything. A lot of the interior stuff has to be up to code, but almost never is it required that the exterior be subsequently brought up to code as well.
So what you're saying is somebody who's really smart needs to get a look at this and figure out how to make it work, or it can't work. And so it's not necessarily a 1-for-1 to solve the housing problem.
Right. But there is some incentive to do it. The bottom line is that offices look cheap relative to residential property to make redevelopment profitable. According to a chief executive of a European office real estate investment trust, the value of residential property needs to be about 50% above that of offices, adjusting for the loss of some leasable space linked to the conversion. This kind of premium is emerging in some suburban areas where home prices jumped during the pandemic. In many central business districts, though, offices are still pricey. Despite high vacancy rates, Manhattan offices are 17% more expensive a square foot than large multifamily residential buildings, according to data. However, this premium has narrowed from around an average of 44% for the 2 years before the pandemic. So, again, mixed bag, right?
Right.